Johnny Jasko at recordproduction.com. We're with Bob Both at Twain Recording Studios in West Milford, New Jersey. How you doing, Bob?
I'm doing good, Johnny.
All right. Well, it's good to be here. And Bob, you've had quite a history in your background. You started recording in the 70s with James Brown, the Godfather. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, how you hooked up with him and how you got started.
Well, James Brown is my claim to fame, although I met him through Polydor Records. When I was about 19 years old, I went knocking on all the doors of these record companies trying to get a job in the music business. I had heard that the A&R departments were the departments that were the creative aspects of music, so I decided I want to be a recording engineer or in the A&R. So I went all these recording studios, all these record companies, just knocking on doors. A naive 19-year-old kid. I had little experience, but a good attitude. I had a recommendation letter from a teacher that I attended art school with that just said that this guy's multi-talented, give him a chance. That's all it really said, one sentence. And I just went knocking on doors. Of course, I got nowhere because I didn't really know anything. But at the end of the day, just before I was about to go home, I stopped at Polydor Records, 1700 Broadway, New York City. I walked to the receptionist. I said, I'm looking for a job. She said, what kind of job do you want? I said, I'm looking for a job in the A&R department. She said, hold on. She comes back in a few minutes. Says, somebody will be right out to talk to you. As it turns out, the A&R director there, Peter K. Siegel, was overloaded with work. He needed an assistant. They interviewed me. He liked my attitude. I didn't have a lot of experience. He thought that was great because, in his opinion, he could then teach me the way he wanted it to be done as opposed to having me unlearn things. I got a job.
A paying job?
A paying job. They hired me as an A&R assistant on the spot, told me come in on Monday. And that's how it all started. So I was basically in there cataloging tapes, working with the A&R director who wanted to spend more time producing records, finding new talent. He wanted the routine, everyday stuff to be taking up less of his time, which is one of the reasons he hired me, so I could do a lot of that stuff. He taught me a lot of things about record production, about mastering, about all that kind of stuff, so that he could lighten up his load. Now, James Brown was one of the major artists on Polydor at the time. One of my jobs was to put records through production and take care of initializing masters. And that was part of what my job was. When I was hired, there was only one office left in the facility. That office happened to be next to James Brown Productions Management Company in a separate wing of the building, but it's the only spot they had left. So I was kind of off in my own little corner, not near my boss. James Brown was told that I was the man to see when you want to put a record through production. You can just go see Bob because that's his job. It was real convenient for him. It was right next door. So he got used to just bringing in a thing and saying, here's my next record. Let's go with it. So that's kind of how I met him. I was working for Polydor as just an assistant. Eventually, James Brown came to me and asked me to put out some records that he didn't have mixes for. He came into my office and plopped the multi-track tape on my desk and said, this is my next record. And I said, fine, but I need a mix. And this is a multi-track tape. You got to give me a stereo mix. His response was, go do one. So I went to my boss and I said, hey, James Brown wants this as his next record, and this is a multi-track tape. There's no mix. He told me to go do one. So the boss said, okay, call up, at that time, Shelly Yakis at the record plant. You go sit with him, mix the record. So I did. Well, what happened is James Brown came several more times, giving me tapes to mix. My boss it got to be a political situation. My boss was like, that's not your job. You're not James Brown's producer. So I'm like, I know. What am I supposed to tell him now? Can't tell James Brown, sorry, it's not my job. I started doing the mixes on my own in my own time, going to the studio late at night, doing it so that my boss wouldn't get pissed at me. Of course, whenever I went to the studio, they had to call the office to get authorization for me to be there, so we would always get back to him. So finally, I was told, don't do any more mixes for James Brown. It's not your job.
Right.
I said, all right, I won't. He brings in another mix for me to do. I figured I'll go do it at night. Nobody will know. I'll go do it. Sure enough, the next morning my boss calls me in and says, you were in the studio last night mixing a James Brown record. You were told not to do that anymore. You're fired. I went back to my office, start cleaning out my stuff. James Brown's manager comes in and says, oh, by the way, Mr. Brown would like to hear the mix you did for him last night. Can you give me a copy? I said, sure, here it is. He says, what are you doing? I said, I'm cleaning out my desk. I got fired. He goes, you got fired? What for? I said, for mixing these records. They told me it's not my job. I shouldn't be doing it. He said, go home. I'll take care of it. At which point, he called up James Brown and said, hey, that kid that was mixing your records, they fired him. You got to remember, at the time, I am a kid. I'm only 20 years old, so I am the kid. James Brown calls up Polydor Records and said, what'd you fire him for? He's doing a good job. The mixes sound fine. I like it. And they're like, hey, he's just a kid. He's not trained. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's just a, if you want a producer, we'll get you the best producer. You're a big star. You can have any producer you want. You can have somebody with lots of talent. We'll get you a big producer. He goes, I don't need him. The kid's fine. Hire him back. Well, of course, the record company doesn't want the artist telling them what to do. So they say, no, we're not going to hire him back. He says, well, if you don't hire him back, then I'll hire him. That's how I came to work for James Brown. At that point, he said, then he's going to work for me. He called me up, said, come on in. You get your office right back. And now I was working for him. And
now you can mix during the day.
Right. Now no more moonlighting. And that's the story of how I came to work for James Brown.
Right. And how long did that last? How long were you working with him?
I worked for James Brown from that point for about 5 years.
So what years were that?
That was 1972 to 1977.
So those were the hot years for
yeah,
James.
my first...
I mean, he was always hot, but those albums were pretty...
Yeah, my first major production for James Brown was Get on the Good Foot, which was a million seller.
That was the first one you were working for James Brown?
Right, that's the first one I did while I was employed for James Brown. Polydor was still, at this point, when he first hired me, trying to get him to get rid of me. Because they didn't like the fact that he had thrown me back in face.
Right.
So they weren't real happy that I was still around. Just because.
A bit of a thorn in their side,
right.
so to speak.
So we were doing the Get on the Good Foot album, and I put this album together. James Brown had a concept, let all the songs run together. Somehow he said, don't let the music ever stop. From song to song, figure out a way that it goes from one song to the next. Use your imagination, do whatever you want. But don't put any blank spaces between any of the songs. So when I put the album together, some songs, as one faded out, the next one faded in. Some would butt right from one to the other. I did all kinds of little things to make one song transition to the next without any blank spots. Put the whole thing together, gave it to James Brown. He took it to the president of Polydor. It's a new album. It's a double album, first James Brown double studio album. Doesn't tell them I have anything whatsoever to do with it. Plays it for them. They say, this is great. This is the best thing you've ever done so far. At which point he turns around and said, the kid did this. From that point on, they never said another word to me about anything bad. From that point on, I guess they realized, okay, maybe we should bite our tongues. Maybe he does know what he's doing.
Right. Now, you were a musician as well, right?
Yeah, I was a guitar player. I mean, my whole background in recording came from playing in local bands. I started playing the guitar when I was about 11, influenced by the Beatles. Like everybody else from that era, wanted to be like the Beatles, so I learned to play the guitar. Probably not too well then at the time. Started a little band in the 8th grade and started later on dabbling with making tapes in my basement. Microphone hanging from the chair with a little Wallensack tape recorder, that kind of thing. So I was dabbling with recording. So the musical aspect is what got me into the production and the recording aspect. When I started working for James Brown, I was not an engineer. I did not have technical training. I learned to do it on the job as you had to do back then. You went in the studio, you watched other people do it. You learned by doing. Nowadays, it's a different ball game too. The technology was a lot different back then. There wasn't as much to learn. It was more instinct. And you were recording bands kind of live. Everything was done at one time, and you were going for a performance. Now recording is not so much about a performance anymore.
Yeah, now
it's a pace this
project, right?
exactly. You know, so these days everything's done with computers. So there's a different learning curve involved. The old way was a great way to learn. A little harder to do that these days. So a little more schooling becomes probably necessary for young engineers starting out. Back in that day, so many engineers and producers got their start just like I did. We were in the right spot at the right time. Somebody said, hey, grab this. We're going to make a record now. You just did it. You flew by the seat of your pants.
You just didn't know it was going to be James Brown's
you
biggest
just did
album,
whatever
right?
you had to do. You threw up some microphones. You started moving stuff around the room, and you just went for it. The technology wasn't as sophisticated. There was only so much you could do. It was all about capturing a performance, capturing a moment, and making it exciting, because there was a limited amount that you could do with it afterwards.
Right. Were you in the room when the recordings were done as well?
In the beginning, I was just mixing. He would bring me his tapes, and I simply mixed them. It wasn't until the third album that I did for him that I began recording. What happened was I was just mixing all these recordings that other engineers had recorded.
Right.
And he was bringing me the stuff, and I would produce the mixes. When we got up to the Payback, which was going to be the fourth album that I was working on for Brown, he came to me one day and said, you know what, Bob? You're doing all these mixes and they turn out great. Imagine how much better everything would sound if you recorded it too. Because if you record everything, you have total control from the beginning, so you don't have to just fix other people's work. It's going to be all about what you wanted from the beginning. So from now on, I want you to record everything as well. And so at that point, I was thrown in the studio to record as well as mix.
Right.
It became a whole different thing then, because the mixing I always did alone. He didn't attend the mix sessions. I would get a tape, I'd go to the studio, I'd mix. I'd be by myself, sitting at the mixer, putting it together the way I wanted. And now all of a sudden I had to deal with the band. I had to deal with him. I had to deal with 13 pieces live at once in the studio. Everything. All at the same time. It was a big jump from just mixing to recording. But you learn.
Right. Must have been exciting though to be with all that action going on.
Well, James Brown was so much about capturing the spontaneous live recording, particularly when he brought in the road band. We basically set up a 13-piece band, which would be 2 guitars, bass, drums, percussion, and half a dozen horns, and James Brown singing in the middle of the room all at the same time. Basically, they performed like they were giving a concert, and we recorded that way. Very little was added after the fact. Basically, the record was made on the spot. Other times, later on, we changed some of the production methods a little. When he wanted to make records and his touring schedule was so busy, we changed some of the production methods, and instead of bringing the road band in, we used all the top New York session players, like Steve Gadd and Will Lee, Joe Beck, Joe Sanborn. All of these guys were on the sessions. Nobody knew. They weren't credited on the records back then. Like now, everybody's listed for everything. Back then, when we used a studio band, it was the top crop of New York session musicians. What would happen then is the band director, Fred Wesley, or Dave Matthews, would write out charts, and we'd get a rhythm section to come in, and we'd cut a rhythm section, guitars, bass, and drums. Then we'd bring in the horn section, overdub the horns, and then if we needed other stuff, we'd have it added afterwards. So we were kind of doing it rhythm, then horns. Still recording live, but not
All at once.
not all at once. Basically, we'd do a live rhythm section and then a live horn section. Then I'd make a mix and send it to James Brown, and he would come in off the road, fly in to New York, drop his vocals on, and go back out on tour. And then I'd mix the record. So that was when we wanted to make a lot of records and he wanted to do it and expedite it. We'd use a studio band to cut the tracks. Some stuff he wanted a certain groove to, we used the road band, but it got a little hard to bring the road band in because you'd have to wait for him to be near New York, or once in a while I'd fly out of town. Sometimes we'd pick a studio
Somewhere.
somewhere.
close.
Criterion Miami, we went there. We went to Wally Hyder's in San Francisco. Cut a few things while he was on tour, dropped in with the road band. I'd fly out, meet him, cut the tracks, take the tapes back to New York, and he'd go on with the tour while I worked on the record.
So you got any inside scoop for us on James Brown? What's the scoop?
Well, you know, my relationship with James Brown was one of working in the studio. I mean, I know there's always the stories about how rough he was to work with, and that was really probably true of the band situation. I don't know, they used to get fined if they were late, if their uniforms were dirty. That was all part of what he deemed necessary, because with a 13-piece band, to keep that many guys on time and in line, he kind of felt like he needed some form of disciplinary. So I think the fine stuff all came just because it was such a big band and such a big organization. To keep everybody doing what they had, he felt like that. In the studio with me, it was different. He was not a technical person. He was not interested in being a technical person. He left all of that in my hands. So he just trusted me to take care of all of what needed to be taken care of. When we went to the studio, he just came in, did his thing, left the rest of it to me. So basically, we just had a very, good relationship, which was pretty much strictly a business deal. I didn't really get to see a lot of the
Personal side.
the downside, I guess, because I was making the records, and the making of the records was always a lot of fun. I mean, it was a lot of work. We went through a lot of work. It was sometimes we were on a very tight schedule. We'd be cutting a rhythm section in the morning, overdubbing a horn section in the afternoon, and then the next day James Brown would be flying in from out of town, cut his vocals, fly back out. I mean, but a lot of the stories that you hear, I mean, he would come in sometimes with a song he had written, and he would have lyrics on a napkin, on a paper towel, He would sometimes be making up the words as he went along. And I never tried to get rid of those things from the record when they were actually little mistakes within the lyrics where he'd fumble a lyric. Most of the time I didn't bother cutting them out. I let them become a part of it. And all his famous things that people joke about, like "they hit me" and "can I take him to the bridge," were all just directions to the band, because a lot of his songs at that point were just a groove, just a vamp, as we called it. And the band would vamp on a groove. And they'd keep vamping on that groove. And when they wanted to change it up, he would say, "Fellas, let's go to the bridge. Horns, can I get some hits?" Well, it was just him directing the band so that the band knew what they were going to do. And I left all of that in on the records. It became a James Brown thing.
Yeah, signature almost.
It was yeah. And people would joke about it, but that was actually just a necessary part of where to go when we're making a record.
All right.
Excellent.
I got one more James Brown question. Then I'm going to ask a little bit of the future stuff. Did he teach you any of the dance moves?
I never was much of a dancer.
You didn't get up off of that thing, huh?
No, I didn't get off of that thing. We were in the studio, and he would fool around a little bit. Wasn't usually because I wasn't giving him a handheld mic. He would have to stand in front of a big boom and kind of be localized. So he kind of like directed the band from there. I had him stand there facing the band, and usually the band was in a semicircle around him, so that he was facing the band, so that when the band played, they were all at the back of his microphone. So I wasn't getting a really tremendous amount of bad leakage into his vocal mic, because I had the back of his mic facing the band. So it was actually a pretty doable thing. He had a very loud voice too, so you could keep the mic level down and still get a good recording of him by being able to keep the mic preamp level down.
Right.
Minimize the amount of leakage you would got. He had such a strong voice.
It's still hard to overdub like that, though, isn't it?
Well,
Is
we
it
almost,
possible at all to overdub like that? You hear the difference.
we almost never did when he cut the vocals live. He would overdub his voice when we used the studio band. When we did the live road band, we never added his voice later. His voice was cut with the track. Everything was just a spontaneous take.
It was a feeling.
And that was it.
Yeah.
If we added some vocals, maybe we added background vocals, maybe some girls doing backgrounds,
Right.
maybe some percussion. But the basic record was made then and there. We didn't change his voice. If we didn't like his voice, we just did the whole thing again.
Another take. Yeah.
And really, he was kind of a one-take guy as far as his voice was concerned. He didn't like to labor over things. He wanted it to be as fresh and spontaneous as possible. He wasn't going to do, even when he came in and added his voice to the tracks we cut, he wasn't a one to labor over a lot of takes. 1 or 2 takes, and he was good to go. Mistakes and all. If there was mistakes, if there's something he really didn't like, he'd say, Bobby, cut that out later. Otherwise, I let it be. It all became part of the James Brown world.
Right. That was a pretty good James Brown impersonation there, too. All right, Bobby. Listen, now, what are you doing now?
Well, I opened my own studio a while after I left Brown. It wasn't even supposed to be a commercial operation. I actually opened it while I was still working for Brown, so I'd have a place to do little productions. It was just meant to be for me. But out here in rural New Jersey, there weren't a heck of a lot of studios, so little by little word got around and people started coming here, and it became a commercial studio. It was an 8-track operation when I opened it up. People would say, when you get 16-track, that's I don't need 16-track. Of course, things being what they were, I got 16-track, then 24, and then it became a big thing. But I did never set out to own a studio. It's just something that kind of happened. And as a result of that, when I left James Brown, by that time I had the studio. I was offered a job at Motown, but I had just built the studio, and I really wanted to give myself a chance to do my thing. I just bought my house, built a studio in it, and Motown said, come to Los Angeles. We want you to head up our rhythm section department, and we want you to do all the tracking of that. We'll fly you out here, and I said, I just put my own thing together, and I actually turned Motown down at the time. I don't look back and ever regret having done that. I just put in all my time with James Brown, and so I just did my own thing for a while. And little by little, over a couple of years, the studio became a viable thing. Now, mostly was working with rock and roll bands at that point, because in New Jersey, that was what happened. Then we got into the 80s, and the punk movement was big, and so I started doing a lot of punk bands. And I still do funk. I still got my James Brown reputation actually, did bring a lot of R&B artists my way. And over the years, I did a lot of that. Prior to my experience with James Brown, I was just a white boy with rock and roll. And James Brown opened doors for me, and my experience working with James Brown obviously, gave me a name in the R&B industry for being able to record solid R&B projects.
Hi. So you have any advice? We have a lot of up-and-coming producers and engineers and artists who go to our site. You have anything that you might want to tell them, or advice you might want to give them?
Well, like I was saying earlier, you do need some kind of education now, being that you have to learn how to use Pro Tools. And that's not something that you just learn on your own. It's good to get some schooling. However, what you really need to learn how to do is work with a live band. I think it really helps younger engineers to get a band in the studio, set up all the mics, and try to record them live, just so you learn that, because the art that's being lost is the art of recording a band like a band. Everything is one thing at a time. Everything is samples. Everything is cut and paste. We put down the drums, then we put down the bass, then we put down the guitar, then we erase the drums and redo them with a drum machine. And so a lot of younger engineers are losing the ability to record a band live. If you say, okay, we're going to put the band out there and they're going to play live, a lot of younger guys get a little bit nervous about that, because they're not used to having to record the whole thing at once. They don't know how to place the mics to minimize leakage, because they're used to everything being done one at a time. When everything's done one at a time, there is no leakage.
Right.
Bleed is not a problem.
Now, when there's his bleed, you don't typically overdub. This is a question I'm asking as someone who is kind of a novice at this.
Well, it depends. You try to minimize it. Usually what you want to avoid is bleed from instruments that you might want to redo. For instance, if you're cutting a band and you think the guitar player is going to want to keep redoing the solo, you cut the whole band but you leave the solo out, so that he can do the solo 100 times. You might get a little leakage. Or the other option is you've got to isolate the guitar amp in a separate ISO booth, so that if you want to replace the guitar, it's not all over the drums.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Or the other way around.
Right.
The drums are on the guitar.
Right, exactly. So then you need to set up isolation within a room. So
that's a little different situation, though, right? Because you're not really capturing that sound all at once, like you're talking about.
Well, you're capturing it all at once, but you're isolating the elements so that you can separate them later. does sort of begin to get a little more convoluted the more you separate everything. Even as you're recording live, it starts to sound more separated. A little bit of leakage is not bad. Leakage is bad when it forces you to have to save things that you don't really want to. When you can't redo a part because there's so much leakage on it that it affects another part, that's a problem.
There's a small amount of leakage.
A small amount of leakage.
You can still overdub and
as a general rule, you don't even hear it. I mean,
right.
If you solo the drum tracks, you might hear a faint guitar in the background.
Right, but with all the other noise
but
coming up around
exactly.
it, that's gone.
So the key to leakage is to just minimize it enough so that it doesn't change the sound of the instrument that you're trying to record. So that each instrument still, you can bring it up or down and keep everything in perspective. But the leakage actually adds a little bit of a live feel to it, and it helps everything sound more realistic. Leakage really isn't a bad thing. If it's controlled, if it's done properly, a little bit of leakage is not a problem whatsoever. People get so uptight about leakage. They get so, it's not separated, it's not this.
It's not perfect.
It doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be a performance,
I think, I notice as the producers and engineers get a little, I don't want to say older, but more seasoned in working with sound and music, the perfection is in the beginning where they want to learn how to do everything perfect. And by the time they're really great at what they're doing, the perfection isn't so important to them anymore. It's more of a second nature to them, how they control it, and they're using their ears to mix, not the science.
Right. Well, if the whole thing about recording is, if you want to get a good recording, start with a good sound. And the older, more experienced engineers, and as you develop the experience, that's what you do. You make it sound good in the room, you put up the mics in the right spot, and you capture the sound the way you want it from the beginning, rather than putting up the mic and messing around with equalizers and effects all this time, trying to make it sound right. My philosophy is always go out in the room, make it sound good in the room. Then when you put your mics up, the mics hear a good sound. You throw them up, and voila, there's the sound. You don't have to struggle with it whatsoever. And of course, musical proficiency on the part of the musicians always helps a lot. The better the musicians are, the better your sound is. But if you go out there and listen, I always go out in the room and listen to the sound. You have to listen to sound. You can't just throw up microphones, come in here, push your faders up, and know what you got. You got to stand out there and listen to the band in the room, listen to the drum set in the room, listen to the guitar in the room. So you know what it is. That way, I have a picture in my mind of what the drums sound like right there. When I open my microphone up and I hear the sound, I know if that's what it sounds like in a room because I've already heard the room. I don't have to change it. If I don't like it, I go change it in the room. Retune the drum, put a little dampening on it, readjust the guitar amplifier. I don't reach for an equalizer right away. Nothing wrong with equalization. I use it as a tool to help shape things, not as something to reach for because I didn't feel like moving the microphone. I'll go move the microphone first and put the microphone in the right spot. I'll go change the tuning of a drum before I start messing with the equalizer. Yeah, you're going to need a little brightness on the snare probably when you're done. All right. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't work on getting a great sound out of it before you touch anything. Right. And I always like to make the band play a song while they're warming up. I don't believe in this tap, tap, tap on a snare drum for a half an hour while I get the sound. Boom, boom, boom on the bass drum. That doesn't work for me. I'll set the band up and say, okay, rehearse the first song. I get my sound check while they're rehearsing the first song. Because why? Because now the drummer's playing with the dynamics that he's going to use during the song. Right, now he's hitting the snare the way he's going to hit it during the sound. I'm getting that sound. Now if I don't like the sound, now I can adjust it to his playing. Not to just some random smacking on a drum that means little to the performance.
Right, right.
And I'll get my sound check while they're warming up. So now I've got my sound. They've got warmed up. They've gotten used to the headphone balance. Maybe I'll have to say, let me hear a little of this or a little of that. If I wasn't able to totally isolate it when we were doing a sound check, basically everything's ready to go after they're warmed up, and so everybody's ready to go. I've got my sound, and we've all kind of done that at one time. We're not bogged down in the hours of tweaking and everything else. I mean, if you start with a good sound, you're right there. And that's kind of how I believe in recording.
All right, Bob. Well, thank you very much for your time. You have anything else you'd like to say before we say goodbye? Or?
Well, I just finished an album with Fred Wesley, who was James Brown's trombonist and band director during the period I was there. So it was great to be back together with him, Clyde Stubblefield, the funky drummer, Jabbo, and a bunch of the old James Brown band members performed on Fred's new album, which is going to be coming out soon. It's for Columbia Music Japan, and it's called Funk for Your Ass. And we just did that here in my studio, mixed it, and the whole project was done here in 7 days.
The mixing.
The whole, no,
Oh,
the recording.
Everything.
Recording,
Wow.
the whole album was recorded, overdubbed, and mixed in 7 days. Fred left after 7 days. I mixed and edited for 2 days. Masters were sent off.
Yeah, there you go. How when you work with professionals, huh?
Yeah, I mean, and you know, and that's you know the kind of thing that I like to do. Nice,
Yeah.
quick, you know, thing, and so I tend to like to work fast. I guess I'm used to working that way from James Brown because you didn't have time. I always said I'm never going to win a Grammy for the best engineered album work with James Brown because you didn't have time to go in there and mess with everything. It was all about capture the moment. I'm going to sing now. You better roll the tape. You know, I never let James Brown open his mouth without the tape rolling. Even if he told me, I'm just going to rehearse, I would roll the tape anyway. Because there were a couple times when that rehearsal, he turned around to me and said, Bobby, I wish we had to cut that one. That was smoking. And I would say, I got it. He'd come running in going, I thought I told you not to record. I said, well, you never know. He said, damn, you're a recording fool. You don't record anything, don't you? And I said, yeah, but... And that was the one. That was the take. And if I hadn't been rolling tape, even though he told me don't roll tape, we would have missed out on the performance. And sure, you get a lot of crap too. But there's always that time when the tape's rolling and you just get that magic moment, you know. And so I like to carry that through. I like to work fast. I don't like to labor over things. I don't rush things when I say work fast, but I like to keep things fresh. I like to do everything at a nice pace so that I'm not bored, the band is not bored, and everything's going along and we're working at a pace that we can enjoy, and we're creating, we're making music, and we're not letting the technology constantly interfere with the production of the record.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Bob, thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure meeting you, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks for coming.
All right. Bye-bye. How you doing, James?